Excitement for life isn't everyone's desire. A creative woman has designs on her ailing husband.
He was the obstacle in the way of her life.
A stunning beauty sweeps men off their feet.
She's a very wanted woman, and not in the usual way for her.
And greed drives a fiancé to sever her relationship.
She couldn't leave good enough alone.
How about fields of gold?
Yellow, you mean?
It's on trend.
It's on school buses.
49-year-old Jane Carpenter and husband Brent share a business and a life in Los Angeles, California.
Though he was 20 years older, he was perfect for her and she for him.
Photographer Jane and graphic artist Brent have enjoyed the success of their design business for many years.
They both loved the creative arts. They loved theater. They really got along and were like soulmates.
But with age, responsibility starts to creep into their glamorous life.
Hello, Carpenter Studios.
Hi, it's Judy from the nursing home. It's your grandmother. She's had another...
Dreams.
She felt responsible for her grandmother, who was getting quite old.
Who wants a nibble?
In the year 2000, the power couple decide it's time to leave city life to start anew in the Arizona desert.
I'm gonna miss these.
And you, of course.
Oh, I'm gonna miss you too, darling, and those dimples.
For Jane, it's a big move.
Here you go.
She had lots of friends and contacts and very involved in the local arts and performing arts as well.
She was a city girl. That's where she belonged, where the action was.
Brent is looking forward to life in the slow lane.
Well, come and visit us.
Yeah, bring your fishing rods.
He was quiet. She was gregarious. He was background. She was foreground.
Cheers to our new home. Cheers.
They were like the odd couple, and yet somehow they were the perfect match.
From the start, socialite Jane has trouble adjusting.
Open wide.
Over time, it only gets worse.
No more.
Oh, please, you're fading away to a shadow. You serious?
For Jane, playing nurse is taking its toll. And now, she acquires another patient.
What?
Her husband has diabetes.
I just sort it out, Brent. I can't do everything.
She liked to be in the center of the action. And now here she was in piddly little Prescott, Arizona, with a sick grandmother, a sick husband, and she felt the responsibility for all of them.
There was a little trouble in paradise. These are not good signs of happy times to come.
To Jane, the future looks bleak.
They had planned on being able to come out here and pick up photography work and different kind of marketing work on the side to supplement their income, and I think they found it more difficult than what they had thought was going to happen.
Instead of a comfortable semi-retirement,
Payments, and Jane was terrified of foreclosure.
That's it. Feel the rhythm. Become the beat.
Jane's no longer in control.
Jane was feeling a lot of stress. So she started getting music therapy from a friend.
We're broke.
She was a very self-centered, egotistical type person. It wasn't about anybody else. It was about what was going to work for Jane.
And I am tired of playing nursemaid.
Honey, you'll get through this. And so will Brent.
Brent? Brent's gone.
Jane had stopped caring about Brent anymore and began to see him as a problem in her life.
One night, I went to bed next to my husband, and the next morning I wake up with an old man.
So something had to give.
In Prescott, Arizona, on June 4th, 2002, Jane Carpenter snaps. Her husband, 71-year-old Brent, has steered her into the slow lane, and she wants out.
On that particular day, Jane woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning. Brent slept in till 7. When he came down to the kitchen, Jane was there. She attacked him by hitting him in the head with 2 rocks.
She hits him over the head, slits his throat, and then finally stabs him so hard in the back, the knife goes through him to the floor.
He was the obstacle in the way of her life, and she eliminated him.
Jane doesn't skip a beat.
I call it compartmentalization. She put the murder in one part over here and then just went on with her life as though it never happened.
She went to visit her grandmother. And when she came back 3 hours later, surprise, she discovered a body on her floor.
But Jane isn't playing the part of a shocked loved one. She's all business.
She calls the neighbor and said, "Please come over, Brent is dead."
Yeah, I'm sure. As dead can be.
As dead as a person can be. That's odd.
Then, instead of calling the police, she calls her music friend.
How you doing? I just got home. Yeah, I found Brent on the floor in the kitchen.
They were appalled because she wouldn't get off the phone.
Oh my God.
And they're looking at Brent laying there on the floor.
This needs to be sealed off. Jane, call 911.
He realizes this is a crime scene.
It is not an emergency, Gary. He's dead. It is a medical situation. I'm sorry, Mom. Yeah.
And she says, he's dead already.
Finally, Jane calls authorities.
We didn't find anything broken, anything pried, anything destroyed.
No sign of a break-in.
But the back door wasn't locked.
Or anything open.
So you said.
And you didn't touch the body at all. Not even to check for a pulse.
I'm no doctor, but I know dead when I see it.
It was fairly obvious it wasn't a robbery, it wasn't a person who came from the outside.
Stranger still, there are no fingerprints.
So no prints anywhere?
No, sir.
Not finding workable fingerprints in a house where 2 people live, that's kind of odd. Typically where people live, they leave fingerprints. It had been cleaned somewhat recently.
Does your dog always bark at strangers?
Yep.
The police have suspicions,
Strange.
but there's no evidence to back it up. Jane quickly gets on with her life.
Yeah, I don't know. Just walked in and he was there.
That was awful. How was he when you found him?
Even talking to her loan officer the day after the murder.
Ugh, the spouse is always the first suspect. It's okay though. I have an alibi. I was visiting my grandma at the old folks' home.
Police had absolutely zero forensic evidence to tie anyone to this crime. Brent's death became a cold case. It didn't look like it would ever be solved.
Jane moves to Indiana, close to her mom. She picks up her career as a designer and for 10 happy years forgets all about life in Arizona.
She ended up on top, CEO of a company and very involved in the local arts, and everything was perfect.
Until the day the past catches up.
The police got an anonymous letter that said that they had seen Jane in the backyard that morning picking up rocks.
The anonymous letter alone isn't evidence.
Come in.
But teamed with new testimony, the police are all ears.
Can you remember her exact words?
It hinges on Jane's conversation with her loan officer the day after the murder.
The specifics of that conversation didn't get disclosed completely. And then about 10 years later, she was able to describe exactly what was said.
She told me Brent's throat had been slashed.
It is something only the murderer could know.
Are you sure they were her exact words?
Absolutely. Oh, I was shocked.
The information about the throat was not made public. There was no one else that would have known about that injury.
Keep this between us.
The only time you could see this laceration to his throat was when he was rolled over, and it was almost from ear to ear.
The witness testimony is enough for Jane to be charged.
Yes?
You're under arrest for the murder of your husband, Brent Carpenter.
The lack of conclusive evidence that it was anyone but Jane was what we call the dog that didn't bark. She was the only one there.
What it came down to was not who did it, but who else would have done it.
In 2016, the jury convicts Jane Carpenter of first-degree murder, sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years.
To see that Jane was going to be held responsible for what she did, nothing will ever bring Brent back, but it did help provide some satisfaction.
Jane's marriage became a lifestyle liability. Instead of growing old together, she wanted to grow old alone.
She saw that he was going to continue to age and that she was going to be responsible for caring for him. And I don't think that that was a situation she wanted to be involved with.
I think she just simply wanted to be rid of him and to be rid of Prescott, Arizona. We didn't understand two things back in 1906. One was the true nature of a psychopath, and the other was that women could be just as deadly as men.
At 24 years of age, Emma Cole has no time to be idle.
I was just a child.
You were 16. Hardly a child.
She's been divorced for almost a year in a small town outside of Sacramento.
No use dwelling on the past.
A precarious state for a woman at the turn of the 20th century.
Well, I hope I have better luck this time.
Huh, you will. You know better now.
Women didn't have a means to survive, and if there was no man around, they had no way to support the family.
Emma intends to stay a woman of means, a skill passed down through her mother, Mary Ann.
Mom, am I doing the right thing?
Oh, darling. Husbands are like hats. You can always get another.
Many of the women in Emma's family, interestingly, went through husbands like they were water. So was it a survival skill? I don't know, but they sure went through their men.
Making things easier for mother and daughter are their looks. English minor William Williams
William Williams.
feels lucky to be husband number 2.
You'll be the death of me.
Nonsense. You'll be baking my bread until we're 90.
Emma LeDoux is beautiful. I mean, remarkably so stunning.
Perhaps I should take the day off work.
Oh, how I wish.
It was sort of her currency. It was her ticket. It was the way she got ahead. And she used it very well.
Okay. Come on, you'll be late.
But Emma is yet to meet a man who can fulfill all her worldly needs.
Emma was a flirt. And even when she was married, she continued to flirt.
I thought he'd never leave.
Emma liked to walk on the wild side.
A husband and a lover is a satisfying arrangement until it comes to a sudden end.
After 2 years of marriage, Emma's second husband died of stomach problems.
The death of her second husband has one benefit. William's life insurance policy makes Emma a wealthy widow.
She got $5,000. He was a pretty straight arrow, William was, and he really wanted to care for his wife.
With a lover waiting in the wings, Emma doesn't have to look for a husband.
Third time's a charm.
Within 2 months of William's death, she married McVicker.
Like the husbands before him, the timber merchant is enamored.
Emma was a charmer, attracted men, and obviously used them.
Albert,
I'm sorry, dearest. Is it my whiskers?
it's just annoying.
But their honeymoon period is short.
I'll make tea.
From an early age, Emma learned to stretch the truth, to create her own sense of truth. She certainly knew how to lie.
My mother has taken ill. I need to go and be with her.
Oh, of course. I'll take leave.
Don't be silly. I'll be perfectly fine. I won't be gone long.
Months into marriage number 3, Emma takes extended leave. But she's not visiting Mom. She's partying in downtown San Francisco.
Well, don't you look beautiful tonight?
The Tenderloin District has a bar on every corner, and they're seedy. And there are red lights in the window. And that's where Emma thrived. She loved being there.
Can I roll you a cigarette?
No, thank you.
Here, she makes her beauty pay double time.
With her looks, she was working as kind of a high-class prostitute there.
Excuse me, gentlemen.
I think Emma was proving to herself and to society that she had learned how to survive in a man's world.
And her fortune delivers another opportunity.
Jane?
Emma?
What are you doing here?
I'm just here for a drink.
A former neighbor and now rich bachelor, Jean LeDoux.
What a lovely suit.
Got it for my birthday. I'm 30 now.
Hey, let's get out of here. This place is a dive.
He was not exactly what you'd call a powerhouse guy. In fact, he was illiterate. I think what Emma saw in him
was someone she could completely control.
Oh, Gene, I'm so happy.
Emma, are you my girlfriend?
Yes. But I'd like to be much, much more.
She wanted to control him because he was very wealthy.
Do you want to be my wife?
Oh, Gina, I thought you'd never ask. Yes. Yes, I'll marry you.
So, what's she gonna do? She's gonna marry him, of course. Bigamy? She'll find a way to deal with that one, and if the time is right.
Emma again improves her income, but she's going to have to work for it.
I don't see why you have to visit your sister so often.
I won't be long this time. I promise.
She has 2 husbands. They are living 46 miles apart from each other.
Yeah, you miss my hair.
Emma starts leading a double life. And she spends a little bit of time here, a little bit of time there.
Darling, you're home. Oh, I have missed you so much.
Well, my darling, tremendous news. We'll never have to part again.
Oh, you're staying.
Emma was smarter than the average psychopath.
Well,
and they're pretty smart to begin with.
No, my darling. You're moving.
She had crafted a way.
What do you mean?
For McVicker to legitimately leave where he was working.
So what we're gonna do is, you're gonna come, and we're gonna get you a job with my mother. Trust me.
But he was never gonna arrive.
In California at the turn of the 20th century, Emma Ledoux has one too many husbands.
It appears that Emma promised Albert a real good time, and he bought some whiskey and they rented a hotel room.
Albert, how exciting. Here's to our new life.
Our new life.
She doses his drink with morphine.
Let me get you another.
Enough to kill him and probably half the residents of the hotel.
She gave him 10 times the amount of morphine it would have taken to kill an adult man.
Patience.
He doesn't die. He's just very sick. And Emma's like, wait a minute, this should have killed him.
Come on, Albert. I've trained to catch.
Emma just watches. In fact, what she does next is buy a trunk.
Hello.
A trunk big enough for a husband.
Thank you.
Don't you want this?
Yes, thank you.
Don't hang yourself with it.
I'll see to it that I do not. Can you be back to pick it up by 2?
Yes, ma'am.
Emma's new life awaits. But the old one is proving difficult to erase.
Emma had to speed up her plans. Even though Albert wasn't dead, he was probably unconscious. And she had to get him in the trunk, and she had to get on a train. He died as a result of suffocation. He was in a trunk. He had drugs on board that suppressed his respirations. He now had bleeding head injuries and a broken nose, and the trunk was packed with clothing. The trunk was shut, and then it was locked and tied.
He was folded up like a sandwich.
Where have you been? Just make sure it's on the 4 o'clock to San Francisco.
But in her haste, she has overlooked one critical detail.
For as smart and clever as Emma was, she forgot the shipping tag.
It's got no tags. It's not going anywhere.
And so the trunk stayed on the platform.
The trunk sits there in the sun.
And the body inside began to decay.
So the station master cuts the rope, opens the strap, and opens the trunk, making a grisly discovery.
And that led to Emma's arrest.
She's a very wanted woman, and not in the usual way for her.
And she was a little arrogant, as most murderers are, and thought she was going to get away with it.
Excuse me, ma'am. Can we have a word?
I know what you want with me, and I will go with you.
When a vial of the very drug used to kill her husband is found in her belongings, it's game over.
A lot of women, especially then, would have maybe been weeping in tears. Not Emma. If she was gonna have her photograph taken and she was gonna be immortalized on film, she was gonna look good. And she did. I mean, gotta hand it to her. She looked very good.
It takes a jury only 6 hours to convict her of first-degree murder.
Emma was sentenced to be executed by hanging. She was the first woman in the state of California to receive such a punishment.
But when Emma pleads guilty, she avoids the noose and receives life in prison. After 10 years, she's out on parole.
She only served 10 years for what was an unbelievably heinous act.
Although there are suspicions, Emma is never connected to the untimely death of her second husband, William Williams. After serving her time, she's a free woman, until she's caught again for a dating scam. She loses her freedom forever, dying behind bars in 1941.
Emma had had many husbands and many men that loved her, but in the end, she died a lonely old woman in a prison. The individual doing this is not psychotic. They have their wits about them, but they have a pathological need for attention.
– 2013, Australia. On the famous Sunshine Coast, Lindy Williams is missing only one thing: a man.
So, how was the date the other night? Horrible. Oh, no! Come on. Oh, it was dreadful. Really. Why?
Lindy always needed a man in her life. She was always looking for the next man.
Who is that?
She was someone who I think was still quite vain and had a lot of friends and was a bit of a socialite.
Oh, like you don't know. You haven't met George Jervis.
George was retired. He was previously in real estate and had done well for himself.
He's a little bit older than she is. He's a big figure in the community. He's into local politics, has a great personality. Everybody liked him.
Lindy Williams.
George Jib. Going in?
Thinking about it?
Oh, the water's beautiful.
The connection is instant.
I was just going to grab a coffee over there.
That'd be lovely.
Cool.
Okay.
Why don't you come over here?
Vegas, baby.
Oh my God! When's the date?
Soon.
It's so exciting. This calls for champagne. Come on.
All right.
But after Las Vegas, only Lindy returns to Australia.
Welcome home. Thank you. Oh, to be back.
Where's George? Oh, he's in Rio having some alone time.
George's absence immediately after their honeymoon is a little strange. But he keeps in touch.
There was an email sent to the soccer club saying that he resigned as president. So his association with the soccer club had finished. There had been payments made to the taxation office in his name. Vehicles had been re-registered. Accounts bills paid.
But it's all a lie. George isn't really in Rio. He never even made it to Vegas.
She's creating this illusion that George is still alive when in fact she has chopped him up.
In 2013, on Australia's Sunshine Coast, there's trouble in paradise. Friends of 66-year-old George Jerbick think he's in Rio because his 55-year-old fiancée, Lindy Williams, is covering up a murder.
It's one thing to commit a murder, but it's another thing to create this fantasy about where your partner has. She went to a hardware store and bought an electrical saw.
She dismembered George's body.
The hands had been severed just below the wrists. The neck had been severed, and the base of the rib cage was where the spine had been severed.
You could say she didn't want him to be identified, but you also could say that she just hated him a lot, and that's what she wanted to do.
Lindy drives 50 miles north with George's torso.
Not surprisingly, Lindy didn't do a very good job of getting rid of the body parts.
Where it was quite residential. It was rural, but there were quite a few properties around, and there were several people who said they stopped on the side of the road.
Yes, I'd like to report a grass fire.
Fire service discovered what they believed to be human remains, the upper torso. of a person. We established that it was a male over 55.
What cracked it was this combination of prescription medication that he had in his system.
We were able to do a toxicology examination that listed out a number of pharmaceuticals.
The burned torso contains 4 prescription medications. Now the police start a painstaking search for every Australian male over 55 prescribed those drugs who has not collected them.
You know, this is door 200. Should have baked a cake.
It was lengthy. The Queensland results were in the vicinity of 700 people. A lot of legwork than just traditional policing.
Detective Cable and Long, we're looking for Alan Robert Pearce. We want to identify him.
I'm going to visit these people to verify if they're alive.
No, he's not here. He moved to Bali.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
They went door to door until they finally had it whittled down to a very small number of people.
200 down. 500 to go.
It was fabulous police work.
One name on the list proves elusive. On their first visit, investigators are told he's overseas.
We were able to check that by travel records.
What they find brings them back to the home of George Jerbick and Lindy Williams.
Hello, Miss Williams. Nice to see you again.
As I told you before, George is overseas.
You did say that, but it's not true, is it?
I think she believed that this day would always come. It's just a matter of when.
What are you talking about? George is in Rio.
She told them that he was out of the country.
George Jerbick hasn't left the country once in the last 4 years. May we come in?
He hadn't been out of the country since 2008. So she was in a bit of trouble now. Lindy is not only now wearing an engagement ring she bought with George's money, she's wearing handcuffs.
Under interrogation, Lindy concocts an implausible story. How she found a body in her bathtub.
We know you killed him.
I would never kill George.
Oh, I just turned up and someone had dismembered a body in my bathroom. Like, who thinks that somebody actually will believe that story?
This woman actually thought people would believe that.
It just was bewildering.
Lindy never confesses, nor reveals where she hid the rest of George's remains.
I thought he was my knight in shining armor.
To this day, she denies everything.
I miss him to pieces.
Just haven't been able to clearly establish what her motive was.
You miss him to pieces.
I don't think that she was a battered woman, or I don't think that she wanted to benefit. I think she just got a bit sick of her life, wanted something new.
In 2018, Lindy Williams is convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of 20 years.
The police did great work in that investigation.
I was always hopeful in this matter, but it was also in the back of my mind whether it was going to be something that was solvable.
Lindy Williams almost got away with the murder of a good man who gave her love and attention. But it still wasn't enough.
Lindy's need to be the center of attention will probably die about 1 hour after she does.
These deadly women untied their wedding knots.
At 2:17 a.m., the phone rang in a brick apartment building on the south side of Chicago, the kind of ring that slices through sleep and leaves a silence heavier than noise, the kind that means something is already wrong, and by the time the receiver was lifted, by the time the words "we found her cross the line," the night of October 12th, 1992, had already made its decision. Sirens bled into the cold air, red and blue lights crawled across cracked pavement, and a narrow alley behind West 63rd Street became a place people would avoid for decades, a place that would be whispered about, a place that would never quite give back what it took. The body lay near a chain-link fence, half-shadowed by a flickering security light that never fully turned on, her coat pulled tight as if the cold itself had been the attacker, her purse missing, one shoe gone, the other twisted at an unnatural angle. And the city, indifferent and awake, moved around her as if this were just another line item in the overnight log. 27 years old. Commuted downtown. Known to her neighbors. Forgotten by the sun. The first officers on scene wrote their notes quickly, hands stiff from the wind, radios crackling with other calls, other lives breaking in real time, and in those early minutes, before the tape went up, before the press arrived, before the word cold case would someday attach itself like a scar, the questions were already piling up faster than the answers. Chicago in 1992 was loud with violence, saturated with fear, a city counting bodies by the weekend and learning how to look away without really looking away at all. Homicide detectives were drowning in files, hallways stacked with boxes, desks buried under Polaroids and manila folders, and this case, at first glance, did not scream exception. No immediate witnesses. No clear weapon left behind. No screaming neighbors stepping forward. Just an alley, a young woman who had not made it home, and a community that would wake up to another headline and then, slowly, to a deeper unease as the days passed and nothing moved. Her name was printed once in bold type, then again in smaller font, then misspelled, then eventually not printed at all. Her coworkers said she was careful, routine-driven, the last person you'd expect to vanish between the bus stop and her front door. Her family said she called every night, never late, never skipped a check-in, and that the silence that night felt wrong before anyone confirmed it. Detectives canvassed the block, knocked on doors where televisions glowed blue behind curtains, asked questions people had learned to answer carefully, and wrote down half-stories that ended with shrugs and eyes on the floor. Someone heard footsteps. Someone heard arguing. Someone heard nothing at all. The alley stayed quiet. The autopsy came back with conclusions that raised more questions than they closed. Cause of death listed in clinical language that stripped the humanity away. Time of death estimated within a wide window that swallowed hours whole. Toxicology clean. No obvious signs of robbery despite the missing purse. No clear evidence of sexual assault despite rumors that spread faster than facts. The medical examiner spoke in cautious terms, detectives underlined phrases in red pen, and the case file grew heavier without growing clearer. Leads were logged. Leads were prioritized. Leads went nowhere. They checked known offenders in the area, men with records thick enough to choke a shredder, men who knew alleys the way some people knew prayer. Alibis were weak, then suddenly strong. One suspect failed a polygraph, then passed a second. Another fled the state, then resurfaced months later for an unrelated charge, only to be ruled out quietly. The bus route was mapped minute by minute. The payphone she was last seen near was dusted for prints already layered under hundreds of others. Surveillance cameras were scarce in 1992, grainy when they existed at all, and the nearest one pointed the wrong way, capturing only a slice of sidewalk and a blur of headlights. In the neighborhood, candles burned down to wax stubs and were replaced by new ones, then by none at all. Flyers peeled off telephone poles. Her mother waited by the phone every evening anyway, as if routine itself could reverse time. Detectives rotated off the case, transferred, retired, burned out, and the files slid lower in the stack, not because it mattered less, but because there were always newer bodies, fresher blood, louder pressure. The word unsolved crept into internal memos, and then the other phrase followed it, colder, heavier, more final, cold case. Years passed, and the city changed its face while keeping its bones. Buildings came down. New ones rose. Streets were renamed. People who had lived on that block moved away, or died, or stopped remembering clearly. Evidence bags sat sealed in climate-controlled rooms, labeled in ink that faded slowly, waiting for a future that investigators hoped would arrive with better tools, sharper science, something that could cut through time the way sirens cut through night. Every few years, a detective would pull the file, read it again, circle the same names, feel the same frustration, and put it back. Then came the DNA revolution, whispered at first, then trumpeted as salvation. Old cases reopened. Evidence re-examined. Hope surged, then thinned. In this case, there was little to test, nothing obvious preserved in a way that screamed breakthrough. Still, they tried. Swabs were retested. Databases were searched. Matches flickered on screens and then vanished under scrutiny. The case refused to cooperate, stubborn as the alley itself, and the community learned to live with the idea that some nights never end cleanly. By the early 2000s, the story had hardened into myth. People remembered details that were never true. They forgot details that mattered. Someone swore there had been a suspect arrested back then. Someone else insisted the police had botched it from the start. Online forums buzzed briefly, then died. A true crime book mentioned the case in a single paragraph, misdated, miscontextualized, another small erasure. The family kept every clipping, every report, every letter promising renewed effort, each one a reminder that time moves differently for the living and the dead. Inside the department, a small cold case unit formed, underfunded, overworked, stubborn by necessity. They looked at patterns instead of people, at geography instead of gossip, at timelines that overlapped in ways earlier detectives couldn't see. They noticed things that had been footnotes before. A vehicle reported idling nearby on multiple nights, a similar assault blocks away weeks earlier that had never been connected, a name that appeared once and then never again. Still, nothing broke. The city held its breath and exhaled disappointment. And then, quietly, almost disrespectfully quietly, a file moved from one shelf to another. A new detective, too young to remember 1992 firsthand, read the reports without nostalgia, without assumptions baked in by years of failure. She questioned the accepted timeline. She questioned the ruling that had closed off certain avenues early. She questioned why one witness had been dismissed so quickly, why one piece of evidence had been logged but never truly explored. The case did not announce its shift. It simply leaned, almost imperceptibly, toward motion. Outside, the alley remained an alley, trash collecting where memory could not. People walked past without knowing what had happened there, without feeling the weight that still pressed into the concrete. Inside police headquarters, the phrase Chicago 1992 cold case resurfaced in conversations, attached now to words like review and retest and possible link. Nothing public. Nothing certain. Just the sense that something old had begun to stir. 30 years is a long time for a secret to stay buried, but it is not forever, and as winter settled in once more, as paperwork crossed desks and names resurfaced from obscurity, the city stood unknowingly on the edge of a revelation that would not bring closure so much as shock, a reminder that the past does not stay quiet just because no one is listening, and that some nights, no matter how long ago they happened, are still waiting for their sirens. The file did not smell like paper anymore. It smelled like time, a dry, metallic patience that clung to the fingertips as pages were turned, and the detective felt it immediately, that low hum that comes when a case refuses to stay asleep. She read without stopping, through reports typed on machines that no longer existed, through margins scarred with coffee rings and tired underlines, through contradictions no one had ever fully resolved, and the longer she read, the clearer it became that the night in 1992 had been flattened by urgency, rushed into a shape that made sense only because everyone needed it to. The timeline was neat. Too neat. The gaps were hiding in plain sight. She started where the others had started and then refused to end where they had ended. The bus stop. The payphone. The alley. She walked the route herself on a night that mimicked the original as closely as October would allow. The same brittle air, the same distant thrum of traffic, the same shadows pooling where streetlights failed. Distances changed when measured by foot instead of assumption. Sightlines opened and closed in ways the diagrams never captured. From one angle, the alley was invisible. From another, it was an invitation. She stood there longer than necessary, listening to the city breathe, and wondered how many times investigators had done this before and still missed what mattered. Back at her desk, she pulled the witness statements, all of them, even the ones marked unreliable, especially the ones marked unreliable. A woman 2 buildings over who claimed she heard laughter, not arguing. A man who said he saw a car idling with its lights off, then recanted when pressed. A teenager who had called in a tip weeks later and never called again. These voices had been smoothed out by time, their rough edges sanded down until they fit the narrative of a random act, a wrong place, wrong time ending that required no deeper excavation. She circled names, then circled them again, not because they were suspects, but because they had been forgotten too easily. Technology had changed, but human behavior hadn't, and that was where she leaned in. She overlaid old reports with newer cases from the same radius, not just murders, but assaults, attempted abductions, anything that carried the same signature of hesitation and control. Patterns began to flicker, faint at first, then harder to ignore. The same kind of vehicle description, vague but persistent. The same hours. The same proximity to transit routes. None of it was enough alone. Together, it started to whisper. She requested evidence that hadn't been touched in years, bags sealed with tape that crackled when cut, labels handwritten by detectives who had since retired or died. There was less than she'd hoped for and more than she'd expected. Fibers that had never been compared because there was nothing to compare them to at the time. A partial print deemed useless in an era that demanded perfection. Notes about a scratch on a forearm that had been photographed once and then forgotten. She sent what she could to the lab, knowing the odds, knowing how often hope went to die under fluorescent lights and sterile procedures. Weeks passed without ceremony. No announcements. No leaks. Just the slow churn of review meetings and internal memos that used words like potential and inconclusive. Outside, the family aged another year. Inside, the case refused to give her the courtesy of a clean answer. She dug into old personnel logs, shift schedules, patrol routes from that night, learning who had been working where and for how long. She noticed overlaps that had never been cross-referenced, officers who responded to multiple incidents along the same corridor, calls logged minutes apart that might have been seconds in reality. One name surfaced again, not as a suspect, not as a villain, but as a constant, a figure moving through the background of reports like a shadow that never quite stepped into the light. He was mentioned once as a passerby, once as a source of information, once as someone who couldn't remember clearly. No record flagged him because there had been no reason to. He lived nearby then. He didn't now. He had never been arrested for anything serious. He existed in the gray space investigators often overlook because it feels safer to chase monsters than to question ordinary men. She tracked him the way modern detectives do, through databases that didn't exist in 1992, through addresses and employment records, and the quiet trail people leave without knowing it. His life had unfolded unremarkably. Jobs gained and lost. Relationships that started and ended. A move out of state, then back again. No violent charges. No obvious red flags. And yet his name refused to let go, tugging at the edges of the case with a persistence that felt less like coincidence and more like gravity. The lab called with results that didn't solve anything but refused to shut doors. The fibers matched a manufacturer, common but not ubiquitous. The partial print was still partial, but technology had sharpened it enough to narrow possibilities instead of dismiss them outright. It was progress measured in millimeters, but progress all the same. She added it to the growing lattice of information, careful not to force connections that weren't there, careful not to fall in love with a theory too early. She went back to the family, not with promises, not with declarations, but with questions no one had asked in years. Details surfaced that had never made it into official reports because they hadn't seemed important then. A comment about being followed weeks earlier. A phone call that ended abruptly. A sense of being watched that had been brushed off as paranoia. Memory is a fragile thing, easily reshaped by time, but some impressions burn too deep to fade completely. She listened, wrote everything down, and left without offering comfort she couldn't guarantee. As months stretched on, the case began to hum louder within the department, attracting attention it hadn't had in decades. Supervisors asked for updates. Cold case meetings grew more crowded. Skepticism sharpened questions, and she welcomed it, knowing that doubt was the only thing standing between her and tunnel vision. She laid out her findings without theatrics, without claiming certainty where there was none, and watched as resistance softened into curiosity. The phrase possible suspect appeared for the first time in an internal document, tentative but undeniable. The man was brought in, not in cuffs, not under lights, but politely, as someone helping to clarify old information. He looked older, thinner, surprised to be remembered at all. He answered questions with the practiced calm of someone who had lived an entire life since the night in question. His story was simple. Too simple. He remembered nothing unusual. He had gone home early. He had slept. He had woken up to a city that didn't yet know it would carry this wound for 30 years. The interview ended without fireworks, without confession, without enough to justify holding him longer. But something shifted in the room, an unspoken awareness that the past had just brushed up against the present. After he left, the detective sat alone with the recording, replaying it not for what was said, but for what wasn't. The pauses. The moments where his eyes flicked away from the camera. The way certain questions produced answers that felt rehearsed rather than recalled. None of it would stand up in court. All of it mattered. She requested a warrant for additional records, pushed for comparisons that would have been impossible even a decade earlier, and waited as the machinery of modern policing creaked into motion. Outside the department, no one noticed. The alley stayed quiet. The city chased newer stories, louder crimes, fresher outrage. But somewhere deep in the system, the Chicago 1992 cold case had stopped being a relic and started becoming a threat, not to the community, but to the man who had believed, for 3 decades, that whatever happened that night had been buried too deeply to ever claw its way back to the surface. Time behaves differently once a case wakes up, stretching and compressing in ways that leave everyone slightly off balance, and inside the department the hours began to stack without anyone noticing until the windows turned dark again. The detective leaned into that distortion, letting the past bleed into the present until the boundary blurred, because somewhere in that blur was the truth everyone else had stepped around. She pulled arrest logs from the early 90s and matched them against transit schedules, cross-checked patrol routes with weather reports, and found comfort in the monotony of work that asked for patience instead of inspiration. This was not about genius. This was about endurance. The man's interview replayed again and again, not as audio, but as memory. The way he smiled too quickly. The way his hands stayed folded when most people gestured. The way he corrected himself mid-sentence as if editing in real time. These were not crimes. These were tells. And tells, when stacked, form patterns. She compared his statements to his old addresses, plotted them on a map that had seen too many red pins over the years, and noticed that his movements followed the same arteries as the victim's routine, not once, but repeatedly. Like parallel lines that never touched on paper but ran close enough to feel the heat. Records came back slowly, the kind of slow that tests belief. Phone logs were incomplete, payphone records non-existent, but employment files filled in gaps where memories failed. He had worked nights then, a job that put him near the bus route, near the alley, near the hour everyone else slept. Coworkers from that time remembered him vaguely, remembered him leaving early sometimes, remembered him saying little. One mentioned a scratch on his arm once, shrugged it off as a workplace injury. Another recalled lending him a jacket after a shift because his had been torn. These fragments were nothing on their own. Together, they formed a silhouette. The lab results followed, understated but potent. The fibers didn't exclude him. The partial print sat within a narrowing field that made coincidence increasingly uncomfortable. It wasn't proof. It was pressure. The kind that builds invisibly until something gives. She brought the findings to the cold case unit, laid them out with care, and watched as seasoned detectives leaned forward despite themselves. This was the moment where enthusiasm could become contamination, where belief could poison objectivity. She kept her voice even, her language precise, and let the evidence do the work it was capable of doing. Outside, the family felt the shift without knowing why. Calls increased. Meetings were requested. Old promises resurfaced alongside new cautions. They had learned how to hold hope without letting it consume them, how to listen for truth without demanding it arrive on schedule. 30 years had taught them restraint better than any briefing ever could. When they asked if there was a suspect, the answer was measured, honest, incomplete. The word interest hung in the air, fragile and loaded. The detective went back to the alley again, this time with a different lens. She stood where the body had been found and traced the likely path backward, step by step, imagining resistance where reports said there was none, imagining compliance where rumors had insisted on chaos. She noticed the way the fence bowed inward, a small detail no one had photographed because it didn't look dramatic enough to matter. She noticed the angle of the light, how it would have illuminated one face and left another in shadow. She noticed how quickly sound vanished there, swallowed by brick and distance. This was not a place for witnesses. This was a place for decisions. She requested a second interview, this time with a different tone. No casual clarification. No friendly recall. This time, the questions carried weight. He arrived with a lawyer, a man who spoke in careful sentences and watched the room instead of the clock. The detective adjusted, asked what she could ask, listened for what slipped through the gaps. He denied knowing the victim. He denied being in the alley. He denied everything that could be denied without confronting the evidence head-on. When confronted with specifics, his answers tightened, compressed, as if minimizing space might minimize consequence. Afterward, the lawyer issued a statement that said nothing and everything, and the department moved cautiously, aware that the line between diligence and overreach was thin and heavily patrolled. Search warrants were drafted and redrafted. Judges asked hard questions. The past was being asked to justify its relevance in a present that demanded precision. When the warrants were signed, there was no celebration, only a quiet understanding that this was the point of no return. They searched his current home first, methodical and restrained, knowing the odds were long. What they found instead were echoes. Old boxes. Papers yellowed at the edges. A jacket that matched the fibers not perfectly, but close enough to draw a breath. A notebook with dates that meant nothing until they meant something. A receipt from a store near the bus route, dated within hours of the estimated time of death. Individually explainable. Collectively unsettling. The search expanded to storage units long forgotten, spaces people rent to hide things from themselves. In one, beneath holiday decorations and obsolete electronics, they found items that should not have survived time so intact. Clothing folded with care. A shoe that matched the missing one in every detail but proof. Evidence that flirted with revelation without committing to it. Chain of custody would be everything. Context would be everything. The room seemed to hold its breath as each item was logged, photographed, sealed. When word began to leak, it did so the way it always does, sideways and incomplete. A reporter heard something. A neighbor posted speculation. The phrase cold case re-entered public vocabulary, attached now to whispers of an arrest that had not yet happened. The community reacted with a cautious electricity, torn between exhaustion and anticipation. Some welcomed the possibility of answers. Others braced for disappointment they had learned to expect. The man was arrested quietly, early in the morning, without spectacle. No cameras. No shouting. Just the click of cuffs and the weight of 30 years settling into a single moment. At the station, he said nothing. His lawyer said enough. The booking photo showed a face that looked ordinary, tired, unremarkable, the kind of face that had passed unnoticed for decades. When the charge was read, it sounded almost surreal, a bridge between eras that were never meant to touch. In court, the evidence was laid out with surgical restraint. Prosecutors spoke of patterns, of probability, of the convergence of details that refused to align by accident. Defense attorneys spoke of time, of memory's unreliability, of coincidence inflated by desperation. The judge listened impassive, aware that this was not just about one case, but about what justice looks like when it arrives late and demands to be taken seriously anyway. The family sat together, hands linked, faces etched with emotions that refused easy categorization. Relief and fear shared the same breath. They had waited so long for this moment that it felt unreal, like watching someone else's life finally catch up to its own shadow. Outside the courthouse, microphones waited, hungry for sound bites that could never capture the complexity of what was unfolding inside. As proceedings moved forward, the city watched itself reflected in the story, a reminder that violence does not evaporate when headlines fade, that unanswered questions accumulate interest over time. The alley behind West 63rd Street remained unchanged, but its silence felt different now, less absolute, as if the concrete itself had registered the shift. The Chicago 1992 cold case was no longer sleeping. It was standing in the light, daring everyone involved to decide whether truth, after 30 years, still mattered enough to change anything at all. The courtroom air carried a particular weight, not quite tension, not quite anticipation, something older and heavier, like dust disturbed after years of settling. And every sound seemed amplified by the knowledge that this room was now responsible for deciding whether the past could still be held accountable. The case moved forward in careful increments, each motion deliberate, each argument sharpened by the understanding that time itself had become both weapon and shield. Prosecutors knew they were fighting not just a defense team, but 3 decades of doubt. The defense knew that the story alone, if told correctly, could poison a jury before evidence ever spoke. The first hearings were procedural, dry on the surface, electric underneath. Dates were set. Evidence lists argued over. Motions filed to suppress items recovered from storage units, framed as relics of nostalgia rather than instruments of crime. The defense painted a picture of a man haunted by coincidence, victimized by modern technology retrofitted onto an era that had never prepared for it. The prosecution countered with method, with restraint, refusing to dramatize what was already dramatic enough. This was not a sprint. It was an excavation. Inside the department, the detective watched from a distance, her role quietly shifting from hunter to witness. She was called to explain her process, her reasoning, the logic that had resurrected a case others had long buried. Under oath, she spoke plainly, resisting the temptation to narrate the emotional arc that had driven her. She talked about maps and timelines, about overlaps and omissions, about the discipline of doubt. The defense pressed her on why this lead, why now, why after so many years. She answered without defensiveness. Because time had changed the questions. Because the case had earned another look. Because the evidence, when finally allowed to speak to itself, had asked to be heard. Expert witnesses followed, voices clinical and controlled. A forensic analyst explained how partial prints that once meant nothing could now narrow a field to a fraction of its former size. A fiber specialist spoke about probability, about how common materials become uncommon when paired correctly. Each explanation was careful to avoid certainty, careful to stay within the boundaries science demanded. The courtroom listened, some jurors leaning forward, others sitting back, absorbing a language that translated uncertainty into weight. Outside, the story metastasized. Headlines simplified what the courtroom complicated. 30 years boiled down to phrases like breakthrough and shocking arrest. Comment sections filled with certainty no one in the room could honestly claim. Some praised the persistence of law enforcement. Others accused them of desperation, of pinning an old crime on a convenient target. The community fractured along familiar lines, hope and suspicion sharing the same streets, the same coffee shops, the same bus stops the victim once used without fear. The defense strategy crystallized quickly. They leaned hard into the erosion of memory, into the impossibility of reconstructing a single night from fragments left behind by people who had lived entire lives since. They brought in psychologists to talk about false recall, about how suggestion can reshape memory until it feels original. They questioned the integrity of evidence stored across administrations, moved between facilities, handled by dozens of unseen hands. They asked the jury to imagine themselves accused of something they could barely remember not doing. The prosecution responded by grounding everything in repetition. Not one detail, but many. Not one witness, but patterns of behavior that repeated too often to be dismissed as chance. They emphasized proximity, opportunity, the quiet consistency of the defendant's presence in places he claimed not to be. They did not ask the jury to feel. They asked them to notice, to observe how often coincidence had to work overtime to keep the story intact. The victim's life entered the record slowly, respectfully, not as a symbol but as a person. Friends described routines. Coworkers spoke about habits, about predictability mistaken for safety. Family members testified with voices steady enough to carry the truth without ornament. There was no theatrics, no pleas for vengeance. Just the quiet insistence that she had mattered, that her absence had shaped 30 years of holidays and empty chairs and unanswered questions. The courtroom listened differently then, the abstract becoming painfully specific. As testimony stretched on, the defendant remained composed, his expressions carefully neutral, his posture disciplined. When he finally took the stand, it was with the confidence of someone who believed time itself was on his side. He spoke of forgetfulness, of ordinary nights indistinguishable from each other, of the unfairness of being forced to defend against a version of himself that no longer existed. His lawyer guided him gently, steering away from details that could snag, emphasizing the impossibility of certainty. Cross-examination was quieter than expected. The prosecutor did not raise his voice. He asked about routes, about work schedules, about why certain memories were vivid while others were blank. He returned, again and again, to small inconsistencies, not to expose a lie outright, but to demonstrate flexibility where there should have been none. The defendant answered, adjusted, corrected, and in doing so, revealed the strain of maintaining a narrative under sustained pressure. Behind the scenes, negotiations murmured and stalled. Plea discussions surfaced and sank. The weight of the case pressed on everyone involved, a reminder that verdicts do not just resolve stories, they reassign them. To convict would be to rewrite the last 30 years. To acquit would be to seal them permanently. The judge maintained control, issuing reminders about decorum, about the gravity of the task, about the responsibility each juror carried into the room every morning. The jury deliberated longer than expected. Days passed without word. Speculation filled the silence, each hour stretching public patience thinner. Inside the room, arguments turned inward, looping back on themselves. Some jurors focused on science, others on story. Some could not get past the time gap. Others believed the gap made the convergence of evidence more compelling, not less. They requested transcripts. They asked to see exhibits again. The court obliged, aware that rushing this moment would taint whatever outcome followed. When the verdict finally came, it arrived without drama, a simple summons back into the room, a shift in posture, a collective intake of breath. The foreperson's voice carried the weight of compromise and conviction intertwined, the sound of 12 people trying to be precise in a moment that would never feel precise enough. The words landed, irreversible, echoing against the walls long after they were spoken. Reactions rippled outward immediately. The family absorbed the decision in silence, tears restrained by years of practice. The defendant showed little, his face unreadable as the future reconfigured itself around him. The courtroom exhaled, tension releasing into something like exhaustion. Justice had spoken, but it had spoken late, and lateness complicates everything it touches. Sentencing was scheduled for later, another chapter waiting to be written, but already the case had changed shape. It was no longer just an unsolved tragedy or a reopened file. It had become a test case, a referendum on whether persistence could outlast time, whether memory could still be weighed, whether a city could look backward without losing its footing in the present. As people filtered out, the alley behind West 63rd Street remained what it had always been, unmarked, unremarkable, a place the city refused to sanctify. But something intangible had shifted there, a loosening of the grip the night had held for 3 decades. The Chicago 1992 cold case was no longer suspended between questions. It had crossed into consequence, leaving behind a community forced to reconcile relief with grief, certainty with doubt, and the unsettling knowledge that some answers, once found, do not bring peace so much as a deeper understanding of how long the past is willing to wait. Sentencing did not feel like an ending, it felt like an aftershock, the kind that rattles structures already cracked, and the courtroom filled again with a quieter tension, less volatile but more personal. This was where numbers would be spoken, where years would be converted into terms and conditions, where the law would attempt to compress 3 decades of absence into a finite measure of consequence. The judge reviewed reports with the same calm cadence used from the bench since long before this case ever woke up, and everyone listened as if volume might change meaning. Victim impact statements carried the room into a different register. They were not dramatic. They did not reach for language that could compete with headlines. They spoke instead of accumulation, of how grief doesn't stay sharp but spreads thin, coating everything, of birthdays marked by silence, of holidays that rearranged themselves around a missing chair. The family described time not as a healer, but as an accomplice, stretching the wound so long it became part of the body. No one interrupted. No one needed to. The defendant declined to speak. His lawyer framed that silence as dignity, as restraint, as acceptance of a process now beyond control. Others read it differently. Silence had always been his most consistent trait, a strategy refined over years, a habit that had served him well enough to carry him here. The judge noted it without comment and moved on, the sentence delivered in a voice designed to withstand appeal. The gavel fell, and with it, a chapter closed in a way that felt both definitive and strangely incomplete. Outside, cameras waited, the story now fully formed for public consumption. 30 years collapsed into a clean arc: crime, mystery, breakthrough, justice. Reporters spoke of closure, of perseverance, of a system that eventually worked. The family stood before microphones and said thank you because gratitude was expected, because anger would have been misunderstood, because this moment was not for complexity. The city nodded along, eager to believe that patience is always rewarded, that time bends toward resolution if enough people refuse to let go. Inside the department, the case was archived again, this time with a different color tag, a different status, a different finality. Commendations were discussed. Lessons were extracted. The detective returned to her desk and felt the unfamiliar quiet that follows obsession, the absence of a question that has finally been forced into an answer. She knew better than to call it peace. Peace implies restoration. This felt more like release, the loosening of a grip that had left marks even after it let go. Appeals were filed as expected, arguments rehearsed around evidence age, around technological hindsight, around the danger of narrative overpowering proof. The legal process shifted into its slower, more abstract phase, one that would take place largely outside public view. The family prepared for that too, bracing for a future where certainty could be challenged in language colder than the crime itself. They had learned that nothing stays settled simply because a court says it is. In the neighborhood, reactions remained divided. Some residents felt vindicated, comforted by the idea that persistence had paid off, that the alley no longer carried an unanswered question. Others remained skeptical, uneasy with the thought that a man could live freely for 30 years and then be retroactively defined by a night everyone else had moved on from. Conversations grew quieter over time, the stories slipping back into the city's background noise, replaced by newer crises, fresher outrage, louder tragedies. The alley itself did not change. No plaque appeared. No flowers stayed long enough to wilt. Life continued to pass through it the way it always had, indifferent to symbolism. Yet for those who knew, who remembered, who had waited, it felt altered, less heavy, as if something had finally been acknowledged there, even if it could never be undone. Places remember, even when cities pretend they don't. Late one evening, months after the sentence, the detective returned once more, standing alone under the same unreliable light. She thought about the first officers on scene, about the decisions made under pressure, about how close the case had come to disappearing entirely. She thought about how easily stories are shaped by urgency, how often they are flattened to survive the weight of too many demands. She wondered how many other files were waiting, not for brilliance, but for someone willing to sit with discomfort long enough to hear what it was trying to say. The cold case unit continued its work, buoyed and burdened by this outcome. Every reopened file now carried an added expectation, an unspoken comparison. Not all of them would move. Not all of them should. Justice, they were reminded, is not a factory line. It is uneven, imperfect, stubbornly human. This case would be cited in trainings, in conferences, in policy discussions about evidence retention and long-term accountability. Its legacy would stretch beyond the individuals it had consumed. For the family, life adjusted again, this time around a different absence. The waiting was over, replaced by a quieter grief that had nothing left to hope for and everything left to process. They visited the grave more often at first, then less, not because the memory faded, but because it had finally been given a place to rest. They spoke her name without catching their breath. They allowed themselves moments of laughter without guilt. Time did what it had always done, but differently now. The city filed the story away under solved, but the echo lingered, a reminder that closure is not a door that clicks shut, but a room you learn how to live in. The Chicago 1992 cold case had delivered its verdict, but its real impact lived elsewhere, in the quiet recalibration of trust, in the uneasy awareness that the past is not done with us simply because we are done with it, and in the knowledge that some truths arrive so late they change not just what we know, but how we understand waiting itself. Appeal season arrived without ceremony, slipping into the story the way winter slips into Chicago, gradual and unforgiving, and with it came a renewed tightening in places everyone thought had finally relaxed. Legal briefs replaced headlines, dense and technical, arguing not about guilt or innocence in human terms, but about procedure, precedent, and the fragile scaffolding that holds verdicts upright. The defense challenged the weight of circumstantial evidence, questioned the retroactive confidence of modern forensics, and warned of a justice system too eager to correct its past by rewriting it. The prosecution responded with equal precision, framing the appeal not as a safeguard, but as an attempt to relitigate discomfort. For the family, this phase felt cruelly abstract. Courtrooms emptied of emotion. Language drained of names. Their lives, once again, were being discussed without them, transformed into citations and footnotes. They attended hearings anyway, sitting quietly behind lawyers who spoke for them, watching judges debate standards instead of suffering. They had learned that justice, at this altitude, does not look down often. Inside the department, the case resurfaced in an unexpected way. A junior analyst, reviewing materials for an unrelated training exercise, noticed something that had been overlooked even in the renewed investigation. It wasn't a smoking gun. It wasn't even dramatic. It was a discrepancy in how an early piece of evidence had been cataloged, a timestamp that didn't quite align with the accepted chain of custody. On its own, it meant nothing. In the context of an appeal, it meant scrutiny. The detective was called back in, her relationship with the case suddenly reactivated. She reviewed the discrepancy, traced it through layers of documentation, and confirmed what she had feared and hoped in equal measure. The evidence itself had not been compromised, but the record around it was imperfect, shaped by practices common in the early 90s and unacceptable by modern standards. It was a crack, small but visible, and the defense seized on it immediately. Court arguments sharpened. The appeal no longer felt theoretical. It felt dangerous. Commentators resurfaced, eager to frame the story as either a triumph under threat or a miscarriage of justice waiting to be exposed. Social media resurrected old doubts, old rumors, old conspiracy theories that thrived in the absence of nuance. The phrase wrongful conviction began to circulate, not as a claim, but as a possibility, and possibility is often enough to fracture public confidence. The family felt the ground shift beneath them again. They had been careful not to celebrate too loudly, not to declare victory in a way that tempted fate, But even cautious relief has momentum, and now that momentum was slowing, threatening to reverse. They revisited their memories with an intensity they thought they'd left behind, searching for anchors, for certainties that could withstand legal erosion. Grief, once processed, now felt provisional. The detective testified again, this time not about discovery, but about process. She explained how evidence had been handled historically, why certain shortcuts had been standard, how those shortcuts did not equal malice. The defense listened politely and countered relentlessly, framing systemic habit as systemic failure. The judge listened longer than necessary, aware that this case had evolved beyond its facts into a referendum on time itself. Behind closed doors, prosecutors weighed risk. Upholding the conviction meant defending not just the outcome, but the integrity of an entire era of policing. Losing it meant releasing a man already labeled, already condemned in the court of public memory, and reopening wounds everyone had been told were healing. There were no clean options, only choices with consequences that would ripple far beyond this case. The appellate decision took months, stretching nerves thin. When it arrived, it did so quietly, through a document that would never trend, never be quoted cleanly. The conviction stood. The court acknowledged imperfections, contextualized them, and ruled that they did not undermine the totality of evidence. Relief came in controlled doses, tempered by exhaustion. This was not triumph. This was survival. But the story did not end there. Within weeks, a journalist filed a records request, digging not for scandal, but for pattern. She found other cases from the same period with similar documentation gaps, some solved, some not, some resting uncomfortably in between. Her reporting did not accuse. It asked. And asking, in a city trained to brace for answers, was enough to reopen unease. The cold case unit found itself under a new kind of spotlight, praised and scrutinized in equal measure. Training protocols were revised. Evidence audits expanded. The Chicago 1992 case became both a banner and a warning, cited by advocates on both sides of the justice debate. It was no longer just a story about a woman lost in an alley. It was about how long the past is allowed to speak, and who gets to decide when it has said enough. Late at night, the detective replayed the case not for errors, but for inevitabilities. She wondered whether this outcome had always been encoded in the facts, waiting for the right tools, the right moment, the right refusal to let go. Or whether it had been shaped by momentum, by belief, by the human need to finish stories that make us uncomfortable. The questions did not accuse her. They followed her. In the city, the alley remained unchanged, but people passed it with a new awareness, not of danger, but of history's persistence. The case had taught Chicago something it already knew but rarely confronted, that justice does not arrive as a single event, but as a series of negotiations with time, each one leaving residue. And as the file settled once more into its archive, heavier now with outcomes and implications, the Chicago 1992 cold case continued to breathe, not as an open wound, but as a reminder that even answers, once found, are never entirely still. Years passed again, but differently this time, with the case no longer a question mark but a scar, visible whenever the city shifted its weight. The conviction held, the appeals exhausted their language, and the man grew older behind walls that did not care about context or controversy. Yet resolution has a way of attracting its own gravity, pulling new attention instead of dispersing it, and the Chicago 1992 cold case began to live a second life, not in courtrooms, but in classrooms, conferences, podcasts, and late-night conversations where certainty was less important than meaning. Criminology students dissected it as an example of delayed justice. Civil rights advocates cited it as proof that time can distort truth as easily as it reveals it. Detectives from other cities called quietly, asking about methods, about mistakes, about what had mattered most when everything else had failed. The story stretched, reshaped by each retelling, sometimes sharpened, sometimes dulled, always carrying the risk of becoming something simpler than it deserved to be. The detective watched this from the margins, uncomfortable with a tension that framed her work as singular rather than cumulative. She knew how close the case had come to remaining buried, how much had depended on persistence rather than brilliance. When invited to speak, she focused on process, on humility, on the danger of certainty. She reminded rooms full of eager listeners that cold cases do not warm up because of one person, but because systems slowly learn how to listen better. Some nodded. Some wanted heroes anyway. The family withdrew from public view, choosing privacy over symbolism. They declined interviews politely, having said everything they needed to say when it mattered most. In quiet moments, they talked about her without reference to the case, without the language of evidence or verdicts. They remembered the sound of her laugh, the way she organized her kitchen, the small rituals that had never made it into reports. This was their resistance, their refusal to let her be reduced to a narrative that did not belong to her. Then, without warning, a letter arrived. It was addressed to the department, not the family, postmarked from a correctional facility in another state. Inside was a single page, handwritten, the script uneven, deliberate. The writer claimed to have known the defendant in the early 90s, claimed to have heard things after the fact, claimed that the night in question had not unfolded the way the court believed. There was no confession, no alternative suspect named outright, just insinuation, just the unsettling suggestion that the truth was messier than anyone wanted it to be. The letter was evaluated, catalogued, assigned the skepticism it deserved. Informants surface all the time, especially after high-profile convictions. Most want attention. Some want leverage. A few want absolution. This one offered nothing tangible, no details that could be verified independently, no evidence that hadn't already been considered in some form. Still, procedure demanded review. The cold case unit reopened the file once more, quietly, reluctantly. The detective read the letter late at night, feeling an old tension settle back into her shoulders. The claims were vague, but the tone was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. It lacked the self-importance she had come to expect. It read less like accusation and more like unease, as if the writer were unsure whether speaking would help or harm. She cross-referenced names mentioned obliquely, chased down dead ends she recognized on sight, and found nothing that shifted the foundation of the case. The letter was ultimately deemed non-credible, filed away, another ghost knocking at a door already closed. Officially, nothing changed. Unofficially, the ripple lingered. Among detectives, it reignited a familiar discomfort, the awareness that no case, no matter how settled, is ever entirely immune to doubt. Among advocates, it fueled arguments already in motion, cited as evidence that the system must always be willing to revisit its conclusions. The media caught wind of it months later, framing it as a potential bombshell that fizzled under scrutiny. Headlines teased revelation without delivering it. Public interest flared briefly, then moved on, leaving behind a residue of uncertainty that never quite evaporated. For the family, the news reopened nothing they hadn't already learned to live with. They had made peace with the idea that certainty is a luxury the living rarely get. In prison, the man remained silent. He did not respond to the letter publicly. He did not issue statements. He aged the way incarcerated men do, quietly, visibly, the years marking him in ways the trial never could. Those who believed in his guilt saw the silence as confirmation. Those who doubted it saw the silence as endurance. Meaning, once again, bent to belief. The detective returned to the alley one last time, not out of duty, but habit. The light had been replaced, brighter now, more reliable. The fence straightened. The space looked smaller than it had in memory, less dramatic, more ordinary. She stood there and felt the weight of all the versions of this place that had existed in people's minds, layered over one another like transparencies. Crime scene. Symbol. Footnote. None of them were wrong. None of them were complete. She thought about the letter, about the years, about the way stories refused to stay finished. She thought about how cold cases never really close. They just change temperature, cooling enough for people to touch them without getting burned, warming again when something new disturbs the surface. This one had done both, repeatedly, and would likely do so again, long after everyone involved had stepped away. As she left, traffic hummed nearby, the city indifferent and alive. The Chicago 1992 cold case receded once more into the background, not erased, not resolved into silence, but settled into a low, persistent echo, the kind that reminds those who listen closely that answers, even when found, do not end stories. They transform them, leaving behind questions of a different kind, questions about memory, about patience, about how long justice can stretch before it becomes something else entirely. Time thinned the noise, but it did not erase it. The case settled into a strange middle distance, no longer urgent, never forgotten, resurfacing whenever the city confronted its own reflection. Policy changes traced their lineage back to it. Training modules referenced it obliquely, anonymized but unmistakable. Detectives spoke its shorthand in hallways, a shared vocabulary of caution and persistence. It had become a lens, not a headline, a way of seeing rather than a story to be told. Then the archive began to talk back. A routine digitization project unearthed material long assumed lost, microcassette interviews mislabeled decades earlier, tucked into a box marked administrative. The audio quality was poor, the voices flattened by age and cheap equipment, but the words were there, preserved like insects in amber. A patrol officer describing a vehicle he couldn't quite place. A resident hesitating, then naming a street the reports never captured. A supervisor interrupting, steering the conversation away from speculation and back toward closure. None of it contradicted the verdict outright. All of it complicated the path that led there. The detective listened alone, headphones pressed tight, recognizing the cadence of an era that prized decisiveness over curiosity. She felt the familiar tightening again, the old instinct to trace and test and verify, even as she knew the threshold for reopening had not been met. This was not new evidence. It was context. And context, while powerful, rarely moves courts. It moves people. An internal memo followed, cautious and contained, recommending no action beyond documentation. The recordings were added to the file, annotated, cross-referenced, their existence acknowledged at last. The department chose transparency without turbulence, releasing a summary that said little and promised less. The public reaction was muted, shaped by fatigue and competing crises. The story flickered, then dimmed. But among those who paid attention, the recordings landed hard. Advocacy groups parsed every syllable, arguing that early steering had narrowed the field too soon, that momentum had replaced inquiry. Former officers pushed back, defending a context few remembered clearly, reminding critics what 1992 had been like, what pressure felt like when radios never stopped and bodies kept appearing. The debate hardened into familiar lines, less about this case than about what people needed it to prove. The family was notified before anything went public. They listened to excerpts they did not ask to hear, voices from a night that had taken everything and left them with fragments. They did not hear answers. They heard haste. They heard fatigue. They heard a system trying to survive its own overload. It did not change what they believed. It changed how they understood the silence that followed. In prison, the man requested the recordings through counsel. The request was denied on procedural grounds, then partially granted, redacted, and delayed. When he finally heard them, he reacted in private. Whatever that reaction was contained by concrete and routine. His lawyer filed a motion anyway, citing cumulative error, the recordings framed as corroboration of a broader pattern. The court declined to entertain it. The law, satisfied with thresholds met, held its line. The detective began to write, not reports, but notes to herself, trying to articulate the unease without turning it into accusation. She wrote about drift, about how cases bend under the weight of urgency, about the difference between wrong and unfinished. She did not share these notes. They were not meant to persuade. They were meant to remember. A symposium invited her to speak on cold case ethics. She declined twice, then accepted on the condition that the case not be named. She talked about listening past conclusions, about the discipline of returning to first principles when the narrative feels too smooth. She talked about the danger of applause. The room was quiet in the way that suggests recognition rather than agreement. Outside the city, A graduate student wrote a thesis that brushed up against the case from an angle no one expected, focusing on urban infrastructure and crime opportunity in the early 90s. The analysis was technical, bloodless, but it mapped the alley and its surroundings with a precision no one had attempted before. The conclusions were modest. Lighting patterns mattered. Sightlines mattered. Transit adjacency mattered. The human element remained opaque. The thesis circulated briefly, cited once or twice, then joined the long tail of academic work that changes how future questions are asked without altering past answers. The alley itself continued to age. A mural went up nearby, not for the case, not for her, but for something else entirely. Color bled into brick. Kids cut through on their way home, unconcerned with ghosts. The city's memory thinned as new residents arrived without context, without obligation to remember. This, too, was a kind of mercy. The detective retired quietly, her desk cleared without ceremony. On her last day, she took one more look at the file, now swollen with addenda and annotations, a living document pretending to be finished. She did not feel pride. She did not feel regret. She felt the calm that comes from having stayed with a question longer than most people are willing to. She closed the drawer and left it unlocked. The Chicago 1992 cold case remained what it had become, not a mystery demanding resolution, not a verdict demanding defense, but a field of gravity that continued to shape conversations, policies, and private reckonings. It had taught the city how fragile certainty is, how resilient doubt can be, and how the past, once disturbed, never quite returns to sleep. Memory does not fade evenly. It erodes in pockets, leaving some details razor-sharp while others dissolve completely, and as the years continued to pass, the Chicago 1992 cold case entered that uneven terrain where certainty survived only in fragments. People who had testified aged into different versions of themselves. Jurors retired, moved, forgot the cadence of the courtroom. Reporters who once chased the story took jobs elsewhere, carrying only the outline of it forward. What remained was not consensus, but residue, a faint charge that surfaced whenever the city talked about justice and time in the same breath. Then a coincidence unsettled the quiet. A violent assault in another Midwestern city triggered a familiar pattern, one that caused a seasoned investigator there to pause mid-briefing. The location. The hour. The proximity to public transit. The methodical restraint. It echoed something he had studied years earlier, something he could not immediately name. When he found it, buried in training materials, it stopped him cold. Chicago. 1992, the cold case that had refused to stay buried even after conviction. He reached out cautiously, not with an accusation, not even with a theory, but with questions. Had the Chicago case ever been compared nationally? Had anyone looked beyond city limits during the years when the suspect moved away and then returned? The answers were unsatisfying. Resources had been limited. Focus had been narrow. The assumption, once the arrest was made, had been finality. Still, the questions lingered, heavy enough to justify a closer look. What followed was not an investigation, not officially, but a conversation between departments that unfolded slowly, guarded by protocol and pride. Case summaries were exchanged. Timelines overlapped imperfectly. Some similarities evaporated under scrutiny. Others refused to. The suspect in the newer case had a different profile, a different history, but the offenses clustered around the same years the Chicago defendant had been living out of state, the same kind of urban margins, the same reliance on anonymity provided by infrastructure rather than isolation. Nothing connected cleanly. Nothing ever does. But the possibility cracked open an old fear, that the night in 1992 might not have been singular, that it might have been part of a sequence no one had recognized because no one had been looking far enough outward. The Chicago conviction complicated everything. If the man behind bars was responsible, the similarities were coincidence. If he was not, then the truth was still moving, still uncontained. The discussion remained internal, deliberately so. No one wanted to ignite speculation without proof. No one wanted to undermine a verdict already strained by time. Analysts compared notes quietly, flagging patterns without drawing lines. The work was cautious, almost reluctant, shaped by the understanding that reopening questions without answers can do as much harm as good. The family was not told. Not because of secrecy, but because of mercy. They had learned to live inside an answer that, while imperfect, had allowed them to breathe again. Introducing doubt without resolution would have been a cruelty no policy could justify. This decision weighed heavily on those who made it, a reminder that justice is not only about truth, but about timing, and timing, once missed, rarely returns cleanly. The man in prison remained where he was, his routine unchanged. He did not know about the conversations, the overlaps, the careful comparisons happening far beyond his reach. Or perhaps he did, sensing the familiar disturbance the way some people sense weather shifting in their bones. He filed no new motions. He requested no new hearings. His silence continued, now layered with the ambiguity of what silence can and cannot mean. In the city, the case surfaced again through art rather than law. A short film, loosely inspired, premiered at a local festival, careful to disclaim accuracy while borrowing atmosphere freely. It portrayed an unsolved crime, a city that moved on too quickly, a truth forever just out of frame. Audiences debated it afterward, some recognizing the shadow it cast, others seeing only fiction. The family did not attend. They did not need another version. The detective, long retired, heard about the film from a former colleague and did not watch it. She had reached a point where representation felt redundant. The case had already written itself into her understanding of time and responsibility. She followed the interdepartmental conversations at a distance, offering insight when asked, withholding opinion when not. She knew how easily curiosity can turn into accusation if not handled with care. The overlapping cases never merged. Evidence refused to bridge the gap. The moment passed, the way moments do when they cannot sustain momentum. The newer investigation resolved on its own terms, the similarities chalked up to the grim predictability of urban violence rather than a single, traveling source. The file notes were updated. The questions were archived. The unease remained. What the episode left behind was not doubt about the verdict so much as a sharpened awareness of scale. One case, no matter how exhaustively examined, exists within a larger landscape of harm that resists neat containment. Solving one crime does not solve the conditions that produce it. Closing one cold case does not quiet the others waiting their turn. The Chicago 1992 cold case settled back into its familiar posture, not dormant, not active, but alert, a presence rather than a process. It had survived investigation, prosecution, appeal, scrutiny, and reinterpretation, emerging as something less like a solved mystery and more like a fixed point around which questions continued to orbit. And in that orbit, the city learned something uncomfortable and necessary, that certainty is often provisional, that answers are shaped as much by the moment they arrive as by the facts themselves, and that even when justice speaks, it does so into a space already crowded with echoes that refuse to be silenced. The echoes grew quieter, not because they vanished, but because people learned how to live with them, the way a city learns the sound of its own trains and stops noticing the vibration until it's gone. The Chicago 1992 cold case became institutional memory, referenced without explanation, understood without introduction. New detectives heard it the way rookies hear legends, half warning, half myth, a story used to shape instinct rather than belief. It was no longer about what happened in the alley. It was about what happens when time is allowed to intervene. Policies hardened around it. Evidence retention expanded. Early interviews were preserved with a reverence that bordered on fear. Supervisors spoke less about clearing cases and more about keeping them open to possibility. These shifts did not make headlines. They did not comfort families waiting on answers. They worked quietly, the way prevention always does, visible only in absence. Somewhere, a future mistake failed to happen because this one had been remembered correctly. The family aged into a new phase of grief, one no longer defined by searching or waiting, but by integration. They spoke of her in the present tense less often, not because she receded, but because she had been woven into everything that followed. Weddings included an empty space without explanation. Children learned her name before they learned the story. Memory softened around the edges, losing its sharpness without losing its shape. This, too, was a kind of survival. Once a year, on a date no one else marked, one family member still walked past the alley, not to mourn, not to remember, but to assert presence. The walk was brief, unceremonious, a private ritual that required no witnesses. The alley offered nothing in return. It never had. But the act itself mattered, a quiet refusal to let the place become anonymous again. The man in prison filed one last appeal and lost it. The language was final in a way only legal language can be, dense and definitive, leaving no grammatical room for return. His name slipped out of the news cycle entirely, replaced by newer defendants, fresher faces. He became what most incarcerated people become to the outside world, invisible. Inside, time continued its slow, indifferent work, days measured by routine, nights by thought. There were moments, according to those who saw him regularly, when he appeared to want to speak, to say something that hovered just behind his eyes. Whether that something was remorse, resentment, or an urge to correct the record, no one could say. Silence remained his chosen posture, now indistinguishable from the silence imposed on him. Meaning, once again, depended on who was listening. The retired detective watched the city change from a distance, neighborhoods shifting, names replaced, old routes disrupted by construction and renewal. She recognized fewer streets, fewer faces, fewer reasons to intervene. Occasionally, a younger officer would reach out, asking not about tactics, but about doubt, about how to carry unanswered questions without letting them calcify. She told them the truth as she understood it, that certainty is useful, but humility lasts longer. The alley was paved over at last, resurfaced during a broader infrastructure project that touched half the block. For a few days, it was closed off, cordoned by orange barriers and the smell of fresh asphalt. No ceremony marked the moment. No one announced it. When it reopened, it looked cleaner, narrower, less capable of holding secrets. The city stepped over it and kept going. Somewhere in an archive, the case file rested among thousands of others, its weight redistributed across appendices and addenda, its story fragmented into components designed for reference rather than reflection. It was cited less often now, its lessons absorbed, its urgency diffused. This is what resolution looks like at scale, not an ending, but a gradual loss of sharpness. And yet, on certain nights, when the city quieted just enough, the old questions surfaced without invitation. What if one witness had been pushed a little further? What if one detail had been treated as essential instead of incidental? What if time had not been both enemy and ally? These questions no longer demanded answers. They existed to remind. The Chicago 1992 cold case had traveled a long arc, from violence to silence, from silence to scrutiny, from scrutiny to consequence, and finally into something less definable. It was no longer a crime to be solved or a verdict to be defended. It was a measure, a way of gauging how much patience a system has, how much doubt it can tolerate, how long it is willing to listen before deciding it has heard enough. As the city slept, trains cutting through the dark, lights blinking in windows that held other lives, the case lingered not as an open wound, but as a pressure point, a reminder that the past does not ask permission to stay relevant. It waits. And when it returns, it does so not to accuse, but to ask whether we are still paying attention. The final years did not announce themselves. They arrived the way most endings do, quietly, without punctuation, folding into the ordinary rhythm of a city that had already carried too much history to pause for one more. The Chicago 1992 cold case no longer appeared in training decks or conference panels. It had done its work. Its language had been absorbed into policy, its cautions encoded into habit. What remained was atmosphere, a faint pressure in the background of decisions, a reminder that time is never neutral. Those who remembered the beginning remembered it differently now. The sirens were less vivid, the alley less ominous, the night less specific. Memory had simplified the scene, not out of disrespect, but out of necessity. People cannot carry everything forever. They choose what to keep. They choose what to blur. This is how survival disguises itself as forgetting. The family reached a point where anniversaries passed without ceremony. Not because the date no longer mattered, but because they no longer needed the date to remember. Grief had shifted from an event to a condition, steady and familiar. They spoke of her in fragments, in jokes, in habits passed down unintentionally. Her presence had become diffuse, everywhere and nowhere at once, which was the closest thing to peace they were ever going to get. In prison, the man's health declined. The years he had outrun finally caught up, indifferent to arguments and appeals. He did not confess. He did not recant. He did not seek the spotlight that had once circled him so hungrily. When he died, the notice was brief, procedural, buried among others. There was no final revelation. No hidden truth surfaced to reorder the story. The silence held. The city noticed only faintly. A few articles ran, cautious and restrained, noting the passing without revisiting the case in full. Commentators debated whether death closes questions or freezes them permanently. Most people scrolled past. The present demanded attention. It always does. The retired detective read the notice and set it aside. She felt no triumph, no vindication, no collapse of doubt. She felt the weight of completion without certainty, a sensation she had learned to recognize. Some stories end not with clarity, but with containment. They stop expanding. They stop asking for more. They remain what they are. She thought again of the alley, now indistinguishable from any other stretch of pavement. She thought of the recordings, the letters, the overlaps that never quite aligned. She thought of how close the case had come to vanishing entirely, and how close it had come, at different moments, to becoming something it wasn't. She accepted the contradiction. Acceptance, she had learned, is not agreement. It is endurance. The files stayed in the archive. No red flags. No pending motions. No annotations waiting to be resolved. Just paper and data and the accumulated effort of people trying, imperfectly, to do something lasting in a system designed for speed. Future researchers would find it occasionally, read it selectively, cite it briefly. They would draw conclusions shaped by their own moment. That, too, was inevitable. The Chicago 1992 cold case did not resolve into a moral. It did not teach a lesson clean enough to quote. It offered something less comfortable and more durable, the understanding that justice is not a destination, but a process that ages alongside the people who pursue it. That answers can arrive late and still matter. That doubt does not always mean failure. Sometimes it means honesty. On certain nights, when the city slowed and the noise fell back just enough, the memory of that first phone call still seemed to echo, not as sound, but as sensation. A reminder that something happened here, that it was seen, that it was carried forward, however unevenly. The case did not ask to be remembered. It simply refused to disappear. And so it remained, not open, not closed, but held, suspended in the shared consciousness of a place that knows better than to believe the past ever truly leaves. The Chicago 1992 cold case became what all such stories eventually become, a quiet measure of how long we are willing to sit with what we cannot fully resolve and whether, in that waiting, we learn to listen a little more carefully to the silence left behind. If there was an afterlife for cases, this would have been it, the quiet stretch where nothing new happens and meaning seeps in anyway, slow and uninvited. The Chicago 1992 cold case existed now only in the margins, in the way detectives paused an extra second before closing a file, in the way supervisors asked one more question than policy required. It had become a reflex rather than a reference, a muscle memory formed by years of tension and release. The city moved forward the way cities always do, building over old ground, renaming familiar corridors, layering new stories on top of old ones until the weight redistributed. Children grew up never knowing why a particular alley once made adults cross the street without explanation. New residents learned the neighborhood through cafes and bus schedules, not through cautionary whispers. History did not vanish. It thinned, spread out, absorbed. Occasionally, a student or journalist would stumble across the case, drawn by a footnote or an outdated headline, and try to make sense of it with fresh eyes. They would notice the same contradictions everyone else had noticed. They would ask the same questions. Why did it take so long? Why here? Why her? They would search for a definitive answer and find only layers, each one defensible, none of them complete. Most would move on. A few would carry it with them longer than expected. The family continued their lives in ways that would have looked ordinary to anyone watching from the outside. That ordinariness was hard-won. It was built from repetition, from choosing continuity over collapse, from learning how to let memory exist without demanding it justify itself. They did not seek meaning in the verdict anymore. Meaning, they had learned, is not something the system can deliver on command. In professional circles, the case quietly altered how cold cases were described. Less triumph. More caution. Fewer promises of closure. More acknowledgement of cost. Trainers spoke about it without embellishment, using it to illustrate not success or failure, but endurance. The ability to stay with uncertainty without letting it turn corrosive. The discipline of returning to evidence without expecting it to absolve anyone of doubt. Some nights, the city still sounded the same as it had in 1992, sirens threading through darkened streets, radios murmuring with other emergencies, other lives intersecting with chance. Somewhere, another phone rang. Somewhere, another night began to harden into memory. The machinery of consequence never stopped. It only changed faces. The alley remained unmarked, which in its own way was honest. No plaque could have held the complexity. No inscription could have contained the years. It existed now as negative space, meaningful only to those who knew what was missing. That knowledge passed quietly, not inherited so much as discovered, each generation deciding for itself how much of the past it was willing to carry. The Chicago 1992 cold case did not fade into legend. It did not demand remembrance. It settled into the background hum of the city, present but unobtrusive, like a low note sustained beneath everything else. It reminded those who listened that resolution is not the same as certainty, that justice is not a single moment but a long negotiation with time, and that some truths do not arrive to conclude a story, but to complicate it forever. And so the case endured, not as an open wound, not as a sealed victory, but as a quiet pressure, a reminder etched into practice rather than memory. The night it began was long gone. The questions it raised were not. They lingered in the spaces between answers, in the pauses before decisions, in the silence that follows when the city exhales and keeps moving, carrying with it everything it has chosen not to forget. Time did what it always does when no one is watching closely enough. It rearranged the meaning of things. The Chicago 1992 cold case stopped being a reference point and became a texture, something felt rather than sighted, like humidity before a storm. It shaped decisions without announcing itself, influenced judgment without asking permission. Those who carried it rarely spoke its name anymore. Names have weight. Silence travels lighter. New detectives entered the force with no memory of the headlines, no emotional residue tied to the photographs that once filled newsprint and late-night